Cool. So yesterday we had built a small application, sorry, a small website, I guess. Very, very, very basic website with nothing but an index.html and an about.html. We're going to expand on that today with some images and showing another way of utilizing JavaScript. And then we're going to rebuild the exact same thing in React. So to talk about DOM just for a sec, the key idea here is that the document object model is essentially the blueprint for how your browser is going to render the HTML that it reads. If we look into wish I had a better picture. If we look into, let's say, our source, this might not be the best example, but you could see that everything is nested in a tree-like hierarchy, and that's essentially how DOM works as well. I'm going to actually look for a slide to better illustrate this. There we go. This should work. There we go. So the document object model tree. We have our document, which will be something like an index.html, or in the case of React, a .jsx or a .tsx, depending on whether you're utilizing vanilla JavaScript or TypeScript. And from that document, we render HTML. If you remember from yesterday, we used tags like HTML to set a lot of properties. Some of those properties were in a head part of the code, which contains things like metadata, the title of the page. Metadata, by the way, is just data that does not actually render in the page, but is utilized by things like search engines and whatnot. We also have links and style. Links will connect us to things like JavaScript files that we can then use, we could then call from, and style is for CSS. Now, the body is actually what we're going to see before our eyes when the document object model renders the HTML file. So this includes things like divs, spans, which are containers, and text elements like paragraph, headers, and other visual elements like images and lists. So that's DOM in a nutshell. This is why when we're writing out our tags, we have like this indentation format that very much parallels how the DOM is actually going to be rendering the HTML. So here's just another way of looking at that. We seeing side by side the model and document. This should help you visualize as you're writing your code how elements are going to be rendered when a user is viewing your page. So let's see all of this in action. Going back to our application from yesterday, or sorry, I keep saying app, our little website. We've got, if I were to hit Python /m http.server, I can go to localhost port 8000, and we see exactly what we were seeing yesterday. Now, we didn't actually do anything for about, so let's start there. I am going to make, well, we actually did make an about.html already. So let's actually start working on this right now. If you remember from yesterday, we were able to utilize HTML:5 to provide a boilerplate. From here, we can adjust our title and we can jump straight into writing out some code. And in this case, let's start by, let's have a header. And let's just say hello world. What else? Oh, we want to, right. Forgot to mention, the assignment for today is replace images. It should be fairly quick, but if you feel like you need time working in React, I recommend that you do one of the React projects and skip the replace images altogether. So we're going to I'm going to run through this replace images basically, so you at least have an idea of what's happening here. We have to create a very simple HTML page with at least 3 images on it. So using what we created yesterday, that's our foundation. Next, we're going to add alternate attributes, explanatory text. Simple enough. We kind of did that yesterday as well with a dog image. And then we're going to create an external JS file and add it to the document with a script tag. Yesterday, we just used the script tag to write out a JavaScript code block. But today, we're going to actually create an external script. We're then going to add a button to the HTML page, and this button will replace the images that we've rendered with different images. I think from there, well, in order to do that, we want to use our document.body.getElements by tag name. I think I need to update this because that's a typo. Should be get elements plural. And from there, we should be able to iterate through that list of images and update the source. So that's going to allow us to change our images. So let's start by creating those images. We use the image tag, we use source, and pass in a path. I have here an image directory with several images. So I'm going to type image. I'm going to select my first image. I'm going to close my tag. And I can actually use this / within this tag to close it. What we've been seeing so far is creating an opening tag and then a closing tag separately. For certain elements that don't require anything to be in the middle, like an image, you can just close it immediately within the same, I don't know, sandwich of left-right carrots. So from here, we can duplicate this to create additional images. We're going to have image 1, 2, and 3. And let's take a look at what that looks like right now. All right, so we've got a lot of images. They're very large. And we might want to change that. So I could manually add styling to all of these images or to a container that they're a part of, but honestly, it's better to just use CSS. So I'm going to make a CSS file. I'm going to call it styles.css. And here we're going to take the style that we've got in our existing index.html. We don't need these elements because we're not working with an HTML file anymore. We're working with a CSS file. So we don't need to wrap these in HTML tags. And now we can get rid of this because instead of using this, we're going to say link. And then we're going to say rel to style sheet. And we're going to grab a path to that style sheet. So in our case, just styles.css. And now we can close this. So I save that. And I save this. Oh, I actually need to add something for the images. That's why we came here in the first place. I didn't add any class names or IDs. Remember, hashtags are used to point to our IDs. Periods are used to point to class names. So instead, I could just use the element name itself. So if I were to type image, the following styling will now apply to all images in my website or application if we're building a React application. Let's say width of 100%, and let's give it a max width of 600 pixels. And from here, we can go back to our page, refresh, and it looks like it's not actually. Oh, I think I have to, yeah, I have to call it here as well. So let me grab this. Let me add it to my about.html. I save, now I refresh. Now my images are much smaller. Cool. So we've got the first step to this challenge, which is to create a simple HTML page and add 3 images to it. I suppose we could do the alt attribute. So that was alt equals something like, what did we do yesterday? Okay, we just said like dog image. So let's just say, I don't know, image 1. And then we'll repeat that for the others. Now, we go back to our page. If these fail to load for whatever reason, like let's delete that 0. We get the alternative identifier, which in our case, it just says image 1. So let's save that. And now let's add a button. I'm going to use a breaker first to separate the images themselves from the button that I'm going to create. Button, I'm going to use an onClick. I'm in an HTML file, so I want to make sure my C and onClick is lowercase, as we saw yesterday when we were trying to troubleshoot this for a good 5 minutes. When you're in React, it's going to be a capital C though, so that's going to be a little confusing, but you'll just have to get used to it. So create list. No, that's not what we want to do. What do we want to do? We want to, right, we want to cycle through a bunch of images. So let's leave this blank for now. We're going to go back to it in just a second, and we're going to add the function that we're going to write out. So this is going to replace images. That's what the button is going to say. I'm going to add a function here, but I want to write that function first. So I'm going to write code, something like, I don't know, what should I name this? Replace images.js, I guess. And let's see, now I could write my function. I'm going to say function, replace images. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab the images from the HTML file, from the about.html. And just like the README was saying, we want to use document.body.getElements by tag name to get all the image tags. So let's pass in image, and we should have a list of images. Okay, before I could actually use this, I have to assign it to the button that I want to execute this through. And if we go back to our site, refresh, and open up our terminal, go to our console, and hit this thing. Oh, right. Last thing we want to do is actually import the JavaScript. So that's where we go back to about, and we say inside of our head, we want to say script source equals and the path to our script. In this case, replace images.js, save, refresh, and now we can access our function, which grabs our 3 images, and each image contains all of the data that we need. In our case, what we want to do is change the image itself. So to do that, as we iterate through these images, we're going to update the source. So let's say we could do, because it's JavaScript, we could do a very simple image of images instead of our standard for loop, which has the 3 parameters of index, until the length of an index, like an until condition, and then the action that you want to happen, like not incrementing by 1. This is a lot simpler, and this is really all we need for what we're trying to accomplish. So for image of images, image is going to be the index basically of every value inside of images. We want to, let's just use a very simple switch statement actually. So we're going to take the source of the image, and we're going to create separate cases. If the image is, let's say, Tesla Cybertruck 01.jpeg, that's our case. So when we match this case, then we're going to execute this code block, which is to update the source of the image to, let's say, image 7. Now we need a break because this is a switch statement. If we don't have a break, it's just going to continue to run through the different cases. So let's copy this number of times, fix our indentations. So if it's image 2, we're going to switch to image 8. If it's image 3, we're going to switch to image 9. These numbers are pretty arbitrary. I just had 9 images in this folder, and I decided to use the first 3 and the last 3. And then we're going to revert them back to the way they were before. So 7 will go back to 1, 8 will go back to 2, and 9 will go back to 3. Cool. Saving this and refreshing. If we hit our replace images, we see that it replaces them, and we could switch back and forth. Cool. Any questions on this? All right. So we saw how to do some very basic HTML and CSS and JavaScript even with just vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. Let's now see all of this in action in React. So I have a new project right here. If we go to this directory, let's go to our React lesson. Let's just run through this real quick. When you have a React project, you're going to set up essentially the same way every time. You could use npm create React app, which is what we used to use back in the day, like several years ago. But since then, things have come out like Vite, which is a lot faster and has some cooler features as well. So we're going to use npm create Vite at latest to grab the latest version. From there, it's going to tell us to do the following steps. It's going to tell us to run an npm install, and from there, it's going to tell us that we could use npm run dev to run a development server, allowing us to see the React application on our local machine. While we're still here, let's just talk about this real quick. React consists essentially of components. It's a component-based framework. Everything is a component. And from the components, you have things like state. State is it's a mutable data type, but it exists only within the component it is created in. In order to pass that data down to another component, you have to pass it as a prop. And props themselves are immutable. They cannot be changed. So how the hell do you update state outside of a component? This is where setters and getters come in. State is set using set and retrieved with get, right? The way props work in React, you can pass down these setters and getters. So this is really how you're going to be able to manipulate state from outside of the component that exists in. If that sounds confusing, we'll see it in action in just a sec. And let's see. So here, well, let me backtrack a bit. When we're passing down props, there's two steps to that. A, you have to pass the prop, and B, you have to receive the prop. So the parent component is calling a child component called profile, or I should say returning instead. Return is the JSX magic that allows us to combine HTML and JavaScript to render React components. So when you see something that looks like an HTML element, but with a capital letter, that's a React component. Our React component, well, in this example, it should probably be called child component. These names should match, but let's just pretend that they do for now. If we were to pass down a name, this is what we're doing to pass down prop, by the way. We set the name of the prop that we want to pass down and the value for it inside curly brackets. Same with an image URL. We're passing image URL down as a prop. To receive it, we have to, in our function definition, list the props as a parameter. And from there, we'll be able to access the props that were passed down from the parent using dot notation. There is another way to pass props down, which is called destructuring, and I'll run through that as well in today's demo. Let's see, last thing. And we talked about JSX a bit already. We're going to see some examples of conditional rendering. One of the really cool things you can do in React is conditionally render elements with inline ternaries and conditionals. So we'll see all of that in action. All right, so to create our application, we're going to run npm install Vite at latest. Vite comes with a really cool, whoops, did I do that right? I installed Vite. Oh, create, right. I want to do a create Vite. So npm create Vite at latest because I'm trying to create an actual Vite project. So npm create Vite at latest. It's got this really cool interactive terminal that allows us to say the name of the project. So let's just say Cybertruck images. And then we could select a framework. We've got a lot of options, but we're going to work with React for now. And then we could choose TypeScript or JavaScript, or as well as, oh man, I always blank on what SWC is. It's a compiler. Forget what the SW stands for. Spectrum Web Components Library. So it's just an alternate compiler from the one that React typically uses. I don't know the pros and cons of it. I always just use the default one. I'm gonna select TypeScript just because I like TypeScript. And now I'm going to follow the steps that Feed is telling me to run. So I'm going to cd into my directory, run npm install, and then an npm run dev. And this is our React project. So we can interact with it to see that we're able to manipulate state, but let's get rid of all this boilerplate code and start adding our own stuff. PWD, tell me what directory I'm in. Command click that to pull it up in my Explorer. And from there, everything is going to be inside of the source directory, everything that I want to work with. And I'm going to grab app.tsx and I'm going to delete all this junk that I don't want. So let's get rid of all of this. Maybe leave sort of that. Let's put this too. Let's leave the button so we can play around with it a bit. So now if we refresh after we rerun dev, we have our nothing but our button. So let's leave that there for now. I'm going to delete this. These are some of the default assets that were imported in the boilerplate. And now what we want to do is recreate what we created inside the HTML and about pages from yesterday's challenge. And we're going to do this by creating some additional components. So I'm going to create a components folder, and then I'm going to create a pages folder as well. And the first thing I want to do is, let's see, if we're going to run through, doing a count or sorry. Oh, right. We wanted to talk about destructuring versus passing down props regularly. So I'm going to create two components in here. I'm going to say count example dot tsx because I'm working in TypeScript. I'm actually going to move this over to my pages. And here, just like we were able to do earlier with HTML5, there are extensions that will allow us to very quickly create boilerplate code. In this case, if I want a React functional component, as opposed to a React class component, because we don't want to work with class components at all. They're old, they're outdated, they're clunky, and they're verbose. And everything that you could do with a class component, you could do with a functional component, but a lot faster. We're just going to call a React functional component. So RFC, React functional component. That's going to create some boilerplate. And now I can call this from my app.tsx once I've imported it. So this is count example. I'm going to go back and I'm going to capitalize the C in the function name because React components need a capital first letter. And now I want to set a condition. I want to have multiple pages ultimately. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to create a new state. State is created using this kind of syntax. We're setting essentially a tuple using const, where the first value is the name of the state, and the second value is the method to update this state. And we are able to do this because that's how React is written, and we are using useState with a default value set to something like, let's do 0 for now. Okay, from here, we could say something like, well, normally we would call this component, we would do something like count example, which is the name of the component that we wrote. So if I'm going to move this button to count example, which means I also will need to move state to count example. And I'm going to have to also re-import states. Cool. So everything that was inside the app is now inside count example. And I could simply call count example to render everything here. So let's save. Let's see what this looks like. We see we could still interact with our count button. It's just that we moved it from the main app.tsx file to our count example.tsx file. Now we can add some conditional rendering. But before we, yeah, let's do that actually. So let's say if page equals 1, and it's some strange syntax, but this is how we can create some conditionally rendered components in React. We set a condition and we say basically if and only if count example exists, which it's always going to exist because we've created it, then render it. So in this case, we have a default value of 0. So if we refresh, it's gone. But if we change this back to 1, then we have access to it. Cool, right? If we have a page set to 0, we could also do something like this, where we just say header hello world. And so if our page number is 0, we have hello world. All right. So how are we going to be able to switch the various state values? Let's go ahead and create another component. So I'm going to say new file. I'm going to say navbar.tsx. I'm going to use my handy dandy React functional component to create a very basic boilerplate function. And now I want to start writing out some code. I want to have basically a single row navbar. So I'm going to use span. Like I mentioned yesterday, span and div are very similar. They're both containers. Span is by default horizontally aligned. So here I can now create multiple divs in case I want to have multiple rows in each div. I don't know if I'm going to do that, but let's just do it like this for now. And I'm going to say left container. This is going to be the container that contains my title. And because of the title, let's say header2, and let's say navbar. Okay, let's just copy this because I'm going to also fix my typo. I meant to say left container. Then I'm going to say middle container, and I'm going to say right container down here. We'll get rid of this for the middle because we don't need that. And we'll get rid of this here as well. And for the right container, this is where I want to have the links to our different pages. So I'm going to create an unordered list, which we saw yesterday during the part where we were making the to-do list. And if you don't remember, UL stands for unordered list. And UL or unordered lists consist of list items, which we use LI to create. And each list item is going to be a button. And it's going to say things like home, counter, and images. Because we're going to make, the last thing we're going to do is make an images page to render the Cybertruck images. We are going to want to do some on clicks. Remember earlier when we were in our HTML file, we had on click with a lowercase c. For whatever reason, we have to use a capital C in React. We then set it to an anonymous function where we call the setter that we've passed down. Did we actually pass it down? We have not passed it down yet. So to receive props, I have to write props in my function declaration where the parameters are passed in. And then when I render the nav bar, which I'm not doing yet, so I'm going to import this nav bar. And this is actually from components and not pages. Oops. Now I can call this nav bar. Okay. And again, we're going to want to pass down some props. So the prop we're going to pass down is the set page function. So set page equals set page. I save that and I save this. Should be able to call this function. So let's do the same thing for all of these other guys. Oh, right, one more thing. I have to actually pass in a value, right? So our home page is going to be 0. Our counter page will be 1. I am missing a curly bracket. And then our images will be 2. So let's save all of that and let's see this in action. Cool. As we can see, we are now able to change the pages. Okay, but this is really ugly. That's not how a nav bar should look. So we've now got to add some additional styling. So do we have a CSS file yet? We do, because by default, React, or Vite, I should say, will create some CSS for you. So let's add some CSS. I think, I have not given this a class name, so I'm going to give it a class name. I'm going to call it navbar. And with that, I should be able to now say navbar. We use periods to target class names. And I'm going to do a bunch of stuff like a fixed position. I'm going to say from the top, 0, a distance of 0. From the left, from the left side of the screen, a distance of 0. We want width to be 100% of our viewable screen. So 100, and we want a very small height of something like 60 pixels. Save, let's refresh. And we have an error. Okay. When we added our class name, did I delete something? Yep. Yeah. I see. Like these things got added. Don't need any of that. Delete all that. Okay, refresh. Looks like we're still not. Yeah, our styling's still not being recognized. So Oh, I see. I am not going to pass this in here. No, I'm gonna get rid of this. And I need to actually attach it to something, an element that's being rendered, not a React component. So inside of my nav bar, I've got a span that basically wraps around everything. So this is a great place to pass in the class name navbar so that the navbar CSS can be applied to it. And we see that it's sort of being applied now. We have distance from the top of 0, distance from the left of 0, and this is all kind of centered, but it's not quite where we need it to be. It still needs a bit of work. Let's do a few more things. Let's give it a background color so that it's not so it looks a little obvious that it's separated from the rest of the page. Let's then justify our content instead of just letting them willy-nilly. We're also going to want to set our display to flex. This is going to affect the children that are contained inside of the nav bar. So let's see. I think the last thing we're going to want to do is just set this to white. So the text color will be white. Let's refresh. Okay, this looks a little better, but we still need a bit of tweaking. When we created our containers, we had class names of left, middle, and right container. So if we want different classes or elements to share properties, we could do something like this, where we just say left container, comma, middle container, comma, right container. And then the styling that we want will be applied to all of these. Let's see, what else do we want to do? Let's say maybe all of these will want to have a display of flex because they might have children like we saw in the right. And we also want to, let's do a margin from the top of something like 12 pixels. That might be too much. Let's say 6. And we could do this for shared properties, but we could also create separate CSS blocks for individual properties. So let's say if we wanted a margin on the left, but only for our leftmost container, then we just write left container. And let's set a margin of 40 pixels. All right, that pushed it to the right a bit, so that's good. Let's set our display to flex, justify content to center, and align items to center. Cool, that kind of pushed that a little more towards the middle. I actually want to get rid of this now. I don't want this margin top here anymore. Okay, now my nav bar is centered. Okay, now my right container is going to have, I don't need all that for the right. Actually, I'm going to want a margin right. Okay, that puts it right a bit. Then I want to add, let's do a list style type, none. Okay, that didn't do anything, but what else do I want to do? So if we go back to our nav bar, we have a divider that has a class name of right container. Let's say we have multiple unordered lists in different components, but we only want to apply certain styling to this unordered list. We can do something like dot right container UL for unordered list, and this will only affect the unordered list inside of this container. So let's, I think this is actually where I want this. The list style type does not make any sense for the container itself, but it makes sense for the list. And let's say Just have a padding of 0. Padding, margins, etc. What does all that mean? If you go inside, yeah, here we go. If you go inside here, you use your little selector. You could look at each individual element and see what padding, border, and margins are based on the CSS. So basically, padding is going to be inside the container, border is the edge of the container, and margin is the space outside of that container. All right, so we're setting a padding of 0. So that inside the container, we don't have any additional spacing. And for our list items, we're going to display them in line. And then we're going to have a margin right of 20 pixels so that every button is spaced apart by 20 pixels. And this is starting to look a lot better. It's starting to look like an actual navigation bar. So with that, we are now ready to create our final page because we have count that we can click on, and I think I'm forgetting something. Right, I was talking about destructured props versus regularly passed down props. So here we see that we're passing down props regularly, but if we wanted to destructure these props, which is really just another way of passing them down, we continue to pass them down the way that we were before, right? So set page equals set page. But here, instead of saying props, we say the name of the props that we're passing them, that are being passed down. So now we're passing down set page. And instead of saying props.set page, we could just say set page. So does it work? It still works. So that's all destructuring really is. It's just instead of passing down props as like a dictionary or a container of like these different key value pairs, you can select the props individually that you want to pass down. And so when you call them, you no longer have to specify props dot whatever property name you want to call. You just set the you could just use the property name itself. So that's destructuring, and now we could go back to our final page. Okay, so going back to our app.tsx, we'll do page equals 2 will take us to image example, which does not exist yet, but we'll create in just a sec. So image example. I can make a new file, call it image example.tsx, run my React functional components, and here I can do some image related stuff. Okay, so now for images, you want to be able to display different images, right? So if we do a return, we'll do something like, yeah, let's do image. It's very similar to how it was with HTML. We're just setting an image with a source. The source is going to be a path. I don't have these images yet, I think. So if I go to React image demo, Cybertruck images, name of my project. I mentioned earlier that everything I wanted to work with was inside the source directory. That's kind of a lie. Everything that will be compiled will need to be inside of the source directory, but you could also have static assets inside of your public directory. So things like images, right? I can copy, paste this folder of images, And now these images will be accessible from the React app. And if you look at the path that I'm passing in, it's really just image because it treats public like a root directory. So when you create your React project and you deploy it and it compiles on a website, it knows to pull these images from the public directory. So let's say, what's the Tesla Cybertruck 1 is the image I want to render. And we also want to set an alternative text. So let's just say Cybertruck. And then we'll wrap up our tag. And if we go back to React app, we can see our Cybertruck. Cool. So let's do a bit of styling. Actually, yeah, let's do a bit of styling. We're going to add, just like we did for our other website, for our basic vanilla website, we are going to do image, and we are going to set a width of 100% and max width of, let's say, 900 pixels. We refresh. Now it is smaller, limited to 900 pixels in width. Okay, so going back to our image example, we have one image, but what we really want to do is be able to cycle through various images. So in order to do that, we're going to create a new state. And the state we're going to create is called image. Yeah, let's just call it image. And then we'll use a setter called set image. And this is using state, which we have to import. So import use state from React. And we're going to set a default value of 1. Okay. So what I can do is create many, many, many different images. And well, there really are many ways to do this. I could create a method that allows us to render different images using something like a switch statement, kind of like how we did with the HTML file. Or I could do something like conditionally render each image using our JSX magic. So if I were to say image equals 1 and this image exists, then render this image. We have, okay, we have one divider for our image, but I also want to have a divider for our our buttons that will let us cycle left and right through the images. So I'm going to do a button, sorry, I'm going to do a div first. And then I'm going to do button on click, leave it blank for now. And this one's going to say previous. The next will say next. And now I want to be able to call a function that I'm going to write. So function cycle image. We're going to read value. And then we're going to adjust based on that value. So let's say for now, set image to the value. Smooth.log. And then we'll read the value of image, the state image. And now we could call this method. So cycle, actually, you always want to use an anonymous function when you're calling functions inside of an on-click. So let's say anonymous function will point to cycle image, and we're going to pass in a value of -1. and then a value of +1 for next. So basically, this is going to allow me to increment and decrement the index. Okay, so that means we're going to have to tweak this a bit because we don't want to just set an image to this value. We want to set the image to the current image's value plus that new value. So let's go back to our page. Let's add more images first. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Whoops. All right. Change that to 2. We change that to 3. To 4. Right now I have my 9 images. We go back here. We can cycle through our images. But what happens if we get to the end or the start? Now nothing's going to render when the index is less than 1 or greater than 9. Yes. So at 0 and -1 and onwards, we have no more images. And that's not good. So let's add some ternaries. The first ternary we're going to set is if the image has a value of 1 and the value that we're reading from the button is equals to -1. Basically, this is the previous button that was hit. Then we will set the image to 9. So it takes us to the very end of the list of images. One cool thing about ternaries is they can be strung along. I don't know if you'd say nested necessarily, but they can, yeah, be stringed along into like a long string of ternaries. So this is my first condition, right? I want to set the image to 9 if I'm at 1, and then I want to set the image to 0 if I'm at 9. So I'm now going to check if the image value is equal to 9 and the value from the button is equal to 1 because we don't want to go greater than 9. So this is the condition that's going to set our image value back to 1. Okay, let's clean this up a bit so it's not as confusing. So remember the way ternaries work is they basically will render the first expression if the condition returns true, and the second expression if the condition returns false. So if this value was true, then we set the image to 9. Else, we run this next ternary. And now we're checking to see if the image is set to 9 and the value of the button is 1. If that's true, then we set our image back to 1. Otherwise, we'll just add the value from the button to the image index. So let's see if this works. We can increment, we can decrement, and when we get to the end or the start, it goes back to the appropriate end of the list. Okay, I think that just about wraps up everything that we were going to do for our demo. We saw how we were able to render images, replace and update these images using JavaScript, and we did this both in vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as well as in React. So for those of you working on your projects, continue working on your projects. And for those of you that aren't, run through one of these React challenges. I believe the panel is the more challenging one, which is why it's shown second. And to do should be fairly straightforward. So let's give this a shot. We'll run through some code examples when we come back tonight at 9. Oh no, I did stop recording.